how to plan a watercolor painting. In today's video, I'm going to give you an exact step-by-step guide that you can follow for your own paintings. Welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Michelle, and on this channel you'll find all things watercolor and a little bit of mixed media too. Please do consider subscribing. If you click the bell icon, you can get notified every time I have a video for you. I make one free video a week here on YouTube on a Thursday with extra content on Saturdays for my Patreon subscribers. Now, a few weeks ago I made a video about planning your watercolour paintings, and I spoke about various things that I like to consider when planning a painting. However, the video was so popular and it did occur to me afterwards that some of you want a real step-by-step guide. You literally want, 1 to 10, A to Z. You want to know what to do in what order, because I see people getting really stuck with this. On forums and on Facebook groups, people literally, drawing their picture and then saying, I don't know where to begin, I'm just scared of it, or perhaps they put a background in and I don't know where to go next with it. So I'm going to give you a real step-by-step guide here that you can follow for every painting. Now, let's consider that every painting is not the same and that one size doesn't fit all. So although you can follow this guide for very simple paintings, the more complex your painting is, the more you're going to have to step away from this guide. So this is just something for beginners to get you going, or this is if you've really got stuck with a picture and you don't know where to go next. So if you watch this video through the steps, it will help you to plan each of your paintings. But let me say that the more complex and the more unusual your painting is, the less you will be able to follow a formula like this one. So for instance, if you're painting a landscape, with a sky and a foreground and some trees, maybe a river, or if you're painting a bowl of fruit or a bird sat on a branch, then a guide like this is really going to help you. However, if you've got something really, really unusual, perhaps you have a geisha in full costume, and then behind you've got a mountain, and there are temples, and there is a bird flying, and there are flags or there are flowers, that you know what I'm saying. If you've got something that's really unusual and doesn't fit into that sort of standard painting, that standard landscape, flowers, bowl of fruit, then you're going to have to move away from this guide a little bit. However, one of the things I'm going to tell you, working light to dark, is something that you can take across all paintings that you do, and that's really going to help you. But let's get on and go step by step through this guide. Now, I'm going to tell you right from the start that this is going to be a bit of a Mr. Ben video. Now, if you don't know what Mr. Ben is, when I was a kid in England, there was a program called Mr. Ben. Now, I don't know if it's gone around the world or if it's just in England, but Mr. Ben, at the beginning of each, it was just an animation, at the beginning of each program, he used to go into a costume shop and put a costume on, and then he would be in that world. So if he was an astronaut, he'd then go and have an adventure. This is going to be a bit like that, because I'm going to change clothes a lot, and it's not because I'm vain and I want to wear lots of outfits in this video. I think you can see that that's not the case. However, I'm going to actually take you through the stages of filming one of my own paintings, and I'm going to be doing a longer version of this. So if you want to see the full painting, every brushstroke, then you need to be following me on Patreon. I'll put a link in the description for that. So in this video you will see me change outfits a bit, and that's just because I'll be filming over several days. So you'll see me in this at the beginning and the end of the video, and who knows what will happen in between. So let's get started, and I'll take you through step by step what I do to plan and complete a painting. So there we are. I told you I'd be changing my clothes at some point in this video, didn't I? Now let's get on with stage one of planning a watercolour painting, and for this we're going to choose a really good clear image to work from. So it's time to choose our photograph. Stage one is to choose your image. So here is the photograph I've chosen for this painting. I'm working on quite a small board, and you can see I've got quite a large photograph here. I've printed it off from my computer, and I was careful to adjust the light levels. I've got one of those printers that prints everything dark, so if I sort of adjust the light levels until they become way too bright, then it actually prints off okay. However, even though I've taken time to get a nice large image and I've been careful to get the tones right, I can't be certain that the colours are as they were. I mean, look at this picture. This is a bright sunny day with strong shadows. I can't imagine the sky was this very pale white to off grey. Now, the thing with photographs is they often wash out the skies, particularly blue skies. They'll wash them out and just make them look white. So whilst this is fairly accurate in terms of greens and layouts and the tones are okay, we're going to try and improve it, because you always want to make your picture look more interesting than the photo. So you're going to take the photo almost with a pinch of salt, but you see how important it is to have a really nice big photograph. You know, it's really clear. I've printed it on proper paper. I haven't just run it off on cheap printer paper and not worried about the light levels and not been too concerned about the size and whether it's big enough, you know, anything like that. So I do see people working on photographs that are far too small or trying to work from their phone. You also want to make sure that your photograph is copyright free, so it's either one that you took yourself, or there are lots of sites on the internet and Facebook groups where you can get copyright-free photographs. So really important that you start with a nice large photograph to work from if you're not working from real life. So step 2 of planning your watercolour painting is to prepare your paper. Now this could mean many things. It could just mean finding the right paper. It could mean taping your paper down. But for me, it means stretching my watercolour paper. So whether you stretch your paper or not is up to you. I do recommend it personally. I'm going to show you how simple and easy it is. So the first thing I'm going to do for my painting, once I've chosen my image, is to stretch my paper. So I've chosen my photograph and I know that I want a landscape format, so the board I've got here is a landscape board, and I've cut a piece of watercolour paper. This is Saunders Waterford. I've cut it just about ½ inch, 2 centimetres smaller than the board, and I'm going to stretch my paper. Now, this is not a full paper stretching tutorial. I'm just giving you a quick idea of how to do it. If you want a full paper stretching tutorial, I will put one in the comments of this video, because there are a few things that can go wrong with paper stretching, but I just want to show you how quick and easy it is. So the first thing I'm going to do, I've got a sponge here, just going to wet both sides of the paper. Now your paper, you can use both sides, but one side will probably have a slightly different surface to the other, and then I'm going to turn it and wet the other side. I'm going to wet this side too. So you can see there's no messing around soaking in baths or anything like that. There's some very long-winded ways of paper stretching out there, and there's also a lot of misinformation about, you know, how fiddly and time-consuming it is. I'm just waiting a minute or two, you know, no timer, no sort of exact amount of time to wait, just giving it a minute or two so that it has time to expand. I've then got some of this gummed tape, so this is, you can feel it's smooth, it's not self-adhesive, it's got gum on. You know, things have come full circle. People are actually going back to this stuff now because it's much more environmentally friendly. So there we are, I'm going to stick that side down. You want to do the longest sides first. You see I've got a different sponge here, and that's just so that I don't get any gum on the other sponge. And you can see I'm just tucking the ends round. I've checked the length obviously, but I haven't bothered to cut them to exact length because there literally is no need at all to do that. I'm lining them up with the side of the board, so again I didn't have to cut the paper too neatly. Now at this stage people often think they've done something wrong because the paper starts to bump even more, it starts to buckle. It will have already expanded before you stuck it down, you probably just didn't see it happening. Once you've stuck it down it'll continue to expand. That's completely normal. All I'm going to do now is just leave it. I need to go to the supermarket. I'm going to leave this. What you don't want to do when this board is drying is to stand it upright, because what will happen is any water will drip down and lift the tape at one end. And that's all ready. Let it dry and on to the drawing stage. So step 3 of planning your painting is the underdrawing, and this is the part that sometimes people skimp. I know some people are really loving the painting, and so they sort of they skip this part and they don't do a very good drawing, and then of course it comes back to bite them, because let me assure you that a good painting will never come from a bad drawing. So however much or little drawing that you do at this stage, it really is important that you get it right and it's accurate and that you're happy with it before you start painting. Of course, the opposite is true. Some people do far too much drawing because they're worried about getting to the painting part, and then they've just got a lot of mess and a lot of graphite on the paper. So the rule with this is to do as little drawing as is necessary to inform you about where to put the paint. So I'm going to get on now and do the underdrawing for my painting. So here I've done my drawing, and I've just literally done just the main tree shapes and the pathway. And just adjusting this pathway, always want to make sure I keep that kind of horizontal feel to the pathway and don't just draw a big curve, which from a perspective point of view will make the whole thing stand up and appear to be tipping towards me. So step 4 is to get your materials ready and more importantly to choose your colours. So this is something that amateur artists often skip. They just get started on their painting and just randomly choose colours from their palette. Now a limited palette is really important within a painting, and this doesn't mean that I'm trying to restrict you to only owning a few colours or only ever using a few colours. Nothing could be further from the truth. I love colours, I love having a lot of colours. But within one single painting, if you don't work within somewhat of a limited palette, you're going to find that the effects are very, very disjointed. And the simpler your image is, the more simple your palette should be. So for instance, if you're painting a garden painting with literally dozens of different coloured flowers, you might need 10, 20 colours in that painting. However, if you're painting a sunset where everything is sort of oranges and yellows and browns, you probably can do the whole thing with 3 colours. So there's no exact rule, but I want you to think about your colours from the start and to stick to a fairly limited palette and only add an extra colour in if you absolutely need it. It's particularly important if you're working with pan paints and you have this temptation to just dip in and out of every single colour you own. You'll end up with a very mucky looking, very disjointed painting. So now is the time to choose your colours. So now the drawing stage is done, I'm going to choose my colour palette, and you can't do this too soon really. Now for this painting, because I want to do a painting from my beginner set, my essential set of paints, I am going to be using these colours here, but I'm not going to be using all of them. I'll be using most of them. So these are my essential set, and these are handmade in the UK by Jackman's Art Materials. If you're interested in those, I'll put a link in the description. You can see there are no secondary colours in here, no greens, so I'll be mixing all my greens from these primaries here. This is what's called a split primary palette. It means that you get a warm and cool of each primary, and then you get some earths as well. And from this small amount of colours you can mix many, many more. Now the process for choosing your colours depends much on the subject. It does have its own colour palette, you know, there's not all sorts of things in here. There's not reds, there's not purples, so we are on this limited palette. I'm going to create most of it from the blues and the yellows with just a little bit of earth colours as well. So I'll be using all of these blues and yellows. I'll also be possibly using, well, I'll definitely use raw umber because it's a really useful colour for things like trees and pathways. I might use a touch of the yellow ochre as well for the pathway. I'm probably going to use Payne's grey. It's particularly good for mixing dull, dark greens and for putting darks in. And I may actually use a bit of pink, surprisingly, because I may want to push some of those shadows into lilac. The colours on the photograph are rather plain, so we'll be making them a little bit brighter. But I just want you to get some idea of what colours you're using at the start. So do consider if you want to use an extra colour, or if you can perhaps mix the colour from colours you've already used, and by doing so you'll give your painting a beautiful overall look. Now you've chosen your colours, but there's another step that we have to take before we put any paint on the picture, and this is to reserve light areas. Now this is not always necessary for every single painting. It depends what you're doing. It may not be necessary if you're working botanically. It may not be necessary if you've got very dark subject, but you want to look at this stage and see if there are any really white areas. You know, anything on your paper that's going to be white should be reserved. And reserving doesn't have to mean using masking fluid. There are other methods of masking. I've done other videos about masking. I'll link to one of those up above to give you masking fluid alternatives. But it can just be as simple as drawing around an area. And I think of this most often when I'm doing a still life. I might have a highlight on something. If I don't draw around that highlight, I'm likely to paint across it. I don't have to reserve it with masking fluid, with wax, with anything else. I can just draw around it to remind me that I've got to paint around that area. So that's all reserving means, is to have in mind areas that are going to be white and to get them reserved at the beginning, or to mark them in some way that you will stop yourself from painting across them. You can also, if you want to, reserve light areas which are later on going to have a little bit of colour in, and that's what I'll be doing actually in my painting, because I've got some light coloured trees. They're not going to be white, but I still want to reserve those areas so that they stay pale when I'm going across the top with darker colours. So this is the stage where I'm going to ask myself, do I need to reserve any light areas physically with something like masking fluid? You can also reserve an area just by drawing around it strongly so that you know not to paint across it, something that I often do with things like highlights on vases, but I would equally perhaps use masking fluid. With tree trunks like this, if they were much larger and I was painting on a very big scale, I'd be far more inclined to use something like torn masking tape. It really works a treat. But as it goes, these are very thin lines. I don't want pure white trees, of course, so I will be adding some colour in once the masking fluid has come off, but it will reserve that clean white paper so I can get these light browns on top. I'm also going to use masking fluid to reserve these little white flowers here that go into the distance. It's also important to apply the masking fluid for these white flowers really carefully, because it would be so easy to make them look bigger than they are, to make them look like something like snowdrops, and completely change the time of year. So here's my masking fluid, and for those of you that want to know, this is Schminky white masking fluid. At least it dries clear, but it looks white in the bottle, and I've put a little bit of water in it because it really was going rather thick and tacky. If I paint over a tree trunk with green and then I try to get light brown on top, it's not going to work because of course it's all see-through and the green is still going to show. So if I want these light brown trees, I'm going to have to reserve them in masking fluid first. So I'm going to keep working down here, just reserving some of these lighter trees and also some of these little patches of the white cow parsley. That can stay white. The trees will be painted light brown after the masking fluid has been removed. Step 6 in planning your watercolour painting is to do the sky or the background first. Now, I'm going to put a disclaimer up here. This is not suitable for every painting. Obviously, if you don't have a sky, you wouldn't be doing it first. But I would say in at least 9 times out of 10, if you've got a sky in your painting, you want to put that in at the beginning. It's quite a good idea to fade it lighter as you come down. That means that any dark objects that go over it can be put in afterwards. The other thing to consider is if you have a background, and I'm thinking something like a portrait or a vignette of some kind, or perhaps you have an animal or something like that and you want some kind of loose background behind. It's not an exact rule again, but I would consider if the background's going to be lighter than the object in the foreground, I would consider putting that background in first. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily a good idea to take that background across everything you're painting. You might need to fade it out as you get to the edges of your subject. So this is a bit less of a distinct step, and it's not a step that you need for every single painting, but do consider at this stage, if you have a light coloured background or if you have a sky in your painting, now might be the time to put that in before you do the other parts of the picture. So my first step is to wet this whole top area, and I'm kind of coming almost around the path here. I'm not going right down to the bottom. You want the area wet, but you want to make sure there's no puddles. So if you have puddles, dry your brush and lift out some of that moisture. So I'm going to start dropping some blue in there. Don't panic if it looks too dark, because as it hits the water it will be diluted, and as it dries it will dilute further. When you put a sky in and it seems like you've messed up and you've gone too dark, that's generally the ones that work the best. So be bold, be brave, and remember that almost all skies are darker towards the top. And of course, because we're going to be having some of this yellow in further down, we just want to lighten a little bit as we come down as well. And you see, as soon as I start going into the blue areas, then I start getting some green appearing. And this is just a backdrop colour. This is going to be behind everything else. So the next step is for me to let it dry. At this point, if you're enjoying this video and getting some value from it, could I ask you quickly just to click the thumbs up, just to click the like button. YouTube rewards channels with audience interaction, so if you like, share, subscribe, or leave me a comment, it helps my channel to grow. At the moment, we're in the midst of the pandemic. I'm on lockdown here again in the UK, and I can't teach my regular classes. So what I get from YouTube is so important. You're literally keeping a roof over my head. I'm so grateful to all of you. Please click like. So you've reserved your whites and your very pale areas, and you might have even put your sky or your background in as well. Now it's time to work traditionally light to dark, and this is where I see so many students get into trouble putting the darks in first, because it's really easy to grab those dark strong colours, but if you put them in at the beginning, it's going to be really hard later on, and also there's a good chance that they will run when you paint up to the edges of them. So traditional watercolour painting, light to dark. If you're ever in any confusion as to what to do next or where to start, remember, always default back to light to dark. Again, with a very complex subject, it may not be an exact rule, but it will get you out of trouble time and time again. So we're now going to put our lightest areas in. So here's my original painting. I've got some lights to put in now. What I want to do now is put in the lightest of the green leaves, because we're working sort of light to darks. So it's going to be lights, then midtones, then darks. Of course, there are some lights on these trees that are masked out at the moment, so they'll need to be dropped in at the end, but they have to stay masked for now, so we can put the darker colours across the top of them. Also going to put this light path in. I'm going to build it up by splattering in layers, but I want to put a very pale area down first of all. Now, because I don't necessarily want flat colour here, I'm not going to bother about pre-mixing a colour for this. So I'm just going to take some water down both sides of the path. I'm going to take it out a fair way. I don't want to risk going off the edge of that water. And I'm probably going to start painting the light greens coming down to it while it's still wet as well. And then I'm just going to I'll start off with some raw umber and we'll see how that looks. Yeah, that's fine. I think to give it a bit of life, we'll go in a bit of yellow ochre as well. Just keeping these colours pale. So you can see as I get to the edge of the path there, I'm ending up going into the water, and so we don't get a hard edge. Later on, we just want all of that foliage to come over the path, and we don't want to see that initial drawing. Very little blue needed just to tip that into green. See, already there, almost going too dark. Now when you're working light to dark like this, it's important not to get sort of too het up with the fact that these light colours may not show up very much at the moment. That's to be expected. You see how we go on the sky here, we don't even need to adjust that yellow at all, it's just going to show the blue through. Turn into green. Little lights here, when we get some darks around them, they should make that focal point in the distance there glow. So that's the lights in. What I'm going to do now is let this dry, and I'm actually going to build up the path in several layers. All of this has dried. What I want to do now is to mask some of the pathway with some tiny splatters so we get a sort of a mottled effect, a look that there might be pebbles there, and then we'll end up with a ragged edge here on top of which we will splatter our masking fluid, and it will only go on the pathway. So you can see I've masked off every area that I don't want splatter on, and I've left the pathway, and I've made a really ragged edge. So I've got some masking fluid here. What we want to do actually is try and make larger marks coming forward. What I like to do is actually, as I come forward, once I've got plenty on, I like to dip in and start painting. I'm going to make those marks get a little bit smaller as they go further away. You're looking to create the illusion that this part of the path is closer to you than the part up here. What I want to do now is put another layer over my pathway, and again I'm going to wet around the edges so that we don't have that hard edge appearing, because I just want to add a little bit of brightness. And again I'm just going to let that get completely dry. Then we're going to put the mask back on, and I'm going to splatter with paint. So it's very fine, but that's the effect I'm looking for. We're not really looking to darken anything at this stage. And just for fun, we'll go in with a little bit of the yellow ochre too. So what I'm going to do now at this stage is I'm going to remove the masking fluid from the path only. So what I'm going to do is take an eraser. So we've done our light areas. The next step in planning our watercolour painting is to put our midtones in. This is the point where people tend to get disheartened, because your painting at this point can tend to look really muddy and mucky and dull and boring, but it's just a stage you have to push through and to understand that it will come to life when you put the darks in at the end. So we're going to work now on getting our midtones into the picture. So I'm starting with the Ultramarine and the Hansa yellow because that's the cool yellow. Now you see how this area here has gone a bit blobby. Now I can easily break that up. So I'm going to continue working in now with that lighter yellow. As I come down towards what would be the front of the painting, in other words the area that's closer towards me and this area that I want to stand out next to the path, I'm going to actually change it up and go into the Dairylide yellow. I may even mix a bit more of the Phthalo in to give it some brightness too. Now this is our second to last stage, and we're going to be putting our darks in. This is the point where the painting should start really to come to life. So it's time to go in now with dark paint. It's really important that I am careful and don't cover up too much more of the blue sky, because I'm quite happy with the amount that I've got in place. So I'm mostly going to be going in dark down here and over this side. There's one or two very strong dark trees there as well. I'm going to be starting out with some of the Phthalo, perhaps a bit of the Ultramarine, and probably some of the warmer yellow. I want to make sure that by the end there aren't any white gaps down here. This all needs to be filled in. The only little white gaps will be some of these little tiny clusters of flowers that we made earlier in the masking fluid. And anywhere that there's a yellow leaf, see I've got a yellow leaf here, but it's just set against a white patch of sky. It's never going to show. I can quite carefully make sure that I take some dark paint in around it. So I've added lots more of those lovely dark greens. Can you see that I've concentrated them sort of in bunches in areas? And now I'm looking at getting these dark areas over here and a few down the base around here. And I'm going to keep adding this very dull dark green until I feel the picture naturally has enough of it. So raw umber is, in my opinion, a really underrated colour. It's one that I've included in my beginner set. There are very few browns that are not warm, because it is in the nature of brown, of course, to be a warm colour. But to have a cool brown is really useful. And raw umber, it's kind of wishy-washy and it's kind of light, but it's so useful for light tree trunks and also for things like beeches. It's also good for mixes. You can get all sorts of really nice kind of light, neutral greys, concrete colours, things like that, by combining it with stuff like Payne's grey. So I'm going to get on now and knock out all of these white tree trunks simply with this watered down wash of raw umber. Now, because I didn't pre-draw in those dark tree trunks, what I'm going to do is literally draw across the front of all this dried paint, and then all I'll do is paint in the gaps so that the darker tree trunks will appear to be behind. Now, although there are no actual gaps in the green here, I'm just going to make up a few. And can you see, we're just taking this paint in to get this tree behind the items that are already in the front there. So I'm going to get on now adding more dark trees, but not too many, because overall this is a light and sunny painting. So here's the colour I've mixed up. I started with Payne's grey. I dropped some ultramarine and some pink in it. It went very purple. It was a bit too bright, so I put a little bit of the brown that we used previously in. Now, people get very worried about this idea of mixing muddy colours or dull colours, or mixing too many different colours together. But to be honest, that's not what causes mud. Usually what causes mud is either things like dirty water jars, dirty paint palettes. I wouldn't be mixing an orange from that yellow at the moment until I had cleaned it. And lack of tonal contrast. These things are really important. So when I place these shadows on, I'm going to make sure that they get narrower into the distance. In strong sunlight, you get strong shadows. And it's really important not to put them in too early, because then you end up just taking a wet paintbrush over them and they lose their impact. You also can't judge how dark they need to be until you get all of the other colours in. Now, where we made all the stones earlier on, I'm just literally going straight across all of that. They will show through the shadows to some extent. And again, using this colour just to knock out some of these unnaturally light areas at the side of the path here. There wouldn't be this much light this low down. So I'm going to keep bringing this colour forward and just finish off at the front here. So you might think to yourself at this stage, what's left to do? I've reserved my highlights, I've put my sky in, I've done my light tones, I've done my medium tones, I've even done my dark tones. What else is left to do? Well, there's always a stage at the end where you need to look over the entirety of your work. So this last stage of your painting is all about those final colour adjustments, and most of all adjustments to tonal contrast to ramp up that drama and to get to the point where our painting is finished. So really happy with this painting. It's almost finished. I've put all the main elements in, but there are one or two little areas that I just want to look at, that I just need to adjust before I finally sign off on this painting. So let's look at any areas that just need a bit of adjustment before we finish off. So I've got one or two places here on these light coloured trees where I thought I'd taken all the masking fluid off and I hadn't. So I've got some white patches now. I need to touch these up with the raw umber. And if you have a look here, this was where I smudged the masking fluid and this went across in this uncomfortable straight line. I can easily fix that by dropping some greens in. Look at some of these lighter trees. They're really not standing out very much against the background. If I put some more dark green around and to the sides of them, I can really make the shape of that tree stand out a lot more. The same for this one over here and this little one here. Look at this one here. It barely shows up in places against these pale leaves. All we need is a little bit more dark around it. The last thing I'm a little bit unhappy with is these white flowers. I masked them out. They were tiny little wild white flowers, but they're just a bit too stark. All I'm going to do is get some of this shadow colour I used on the path, water it right down and just drop a little bit here and there into the white. I'm not going to cover up the white, I'm just going to give the impression that there's a little bit of shadow in there. So I'm going to get on and put those final touches on my painting. So what I'm going to do now is allow this painting to dry and remove the pencil marks. Of course, we could go on forever correcting things and adding tonal contrast, but really we'd just end up overworking the painting. Now the light here today in the UK in December in late afternoon is very, very murky when I'm filming. Of course, I've got artificial lights on this, but there's nothing like daylight to see the colours clearly. So when this is all cleaned up and the light's better, I'll take a photograph and I'll put it up in my Facebook group. So if you haven't joined my Facebook group yet, do pop over and join us. The people in the group are some of the kindest, most helpful people I've met on the internet. I take no credit for it, they just seem to have gravitated to my group, but it really is a lovely, supportive place, and all painters of all levels and all media are very, very welcome to come and join us. So do let me know if you found this list helpful in planning your own paintings. I've actually written it out for you in the video description, and I've also put timestamps along the timeline of the video so that you'll be able to jump to any of the bits that you want to watch again. And whilst you're in that video description, do have a look. I've got some free downloadable PDFs that you can grab, some watercolor painting guides, and you can grab them completely for free. Now, if you enjoyed the part of the video where we made a pathway for this landscape, I think you're going to like my beach painting tutorial too. We use very similar techniques, and we also learn how to colour mix so that we get a beautiful natural looking beach, not one that's coloured like a banana. You can watch that tutorial right now.